Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Melanin Margin, the weekly chat show where conversations about race are never off the table. We're your hosts, Quaviondre Williams.
And Daquon Wilson.
So let's get into this week's conversation. What's on the table this week?
It comes as no surprise that understanding intersectionality is necessary everywhere, even in being non binary. As gay Black people, we are aware of how outside perceptions try to keep us from living our most authentic life. So, Andre, what are some gender affirming things that you want to do, but feel that you can't because of who the world expects you to be?
There are a few things in particular that I love to do, but can't for a multitude of reasons. For one, I'd love to get laser hair removal to get rid of this fucking beard I have, but that requires hella coin. Not to mention the fact that those machines have a more difficult time differentiating hair from skin with Black people. I'd also like to wear long, flowy weaves on a consistent basis. I've always seen myself as having that type of hair because, it just feels right. But, in the community that I live in, having that type of hair could put me on the radar of some dangerous people who don't take kindly to people who they see as men displaying any femininity. There was one time where I wore a blonde quick weave that made me feel like the baddest bitch on the game. This was back when we were wearing masks at work, and it was easier, not to get clocked by people if they didn't look close enough. But for those who did, I was called a faggot and made fun of by certain coworkers more often than I had in a long time. And, as confident as wearing that hair made me feel, and as affirming as it was to finally see what I've always wanted to see looking back at me in the mirror, I took it out after about a week because I felt something I hadn't felt since before I came out. And that was shame of who I am. Um, I didn't realize that even though I'm openly a part of the LGBTQIA community, I'm still selectively open. I still code switch when I'm around certain people in certain neighborhoods or environments. I'll keep a cold expression on my face, lower my voice, and even change my walk to avoid unnecessary confrontation. And when I had that weave in and my mask was down or off, it was impossible to hide my identity, which put a larger target on my back than I already had. Without the weave, I can still benefit from the privilege of being perceived as straight and cis when I choose to. The same goes for other gender affirming things I want to do, like, being able to wear more feminine clothing from time to time and get my nails done. Those things make me more visibly queer, which in turn could make being in certain environments that I can't avoid going in more dangerous for me. I had a friend who kept trying to say, well, just be you. You're at risk anytime you're alive. Just be yourself. And, I know she was coming from a good place, and I know that she was trying to be encouraging. But as a cis straight woman, she didn't understand the nuances of the LGBTQIA experience. I'd want nothing more than to be exactly who I am at all times. But we don't live in a world or a society that makes it safe for everyone to do such a thing. To put it simply, I'm scared. Being non binary is still a fairly new discovery for me. And just like when I discovered I wasn't straight, it takes time to be in a position where you feel comfortable enough to be who you are. I hope I'm able to be there one day, but currently I'm not in the place to do that. But Daquan, I want to pass it back to you. What do you think?
I completely agree. I think that, one of the biggest things that I've learned so far is that uh there's a level of safety in privilege. I
Yeah.
can walk out the door without any makeup or anything like that and be perceived as a cis man, and nobody would think anything of it. And there's a safety that comes with that. And
Yes.
even if you are in a very accepting area or a very accepting city or state, it only takes one person to ruin your safety for you.
Yeah.
And so there are plenty of times when, there have been times when I've gone out in makeup because, I thought about it enough. I thought about, where I'm going, how I'm getting there, taking Ubers instead of the subway, doing things that makes me feel a lot more safer to exist in a visibly queer body.
Yeah.
But that you can't do that all the time. So you have to weigh those risks with that possibility. It could be that even if it's a 1 in a million chance, there's still a chance. And the chance isn't just like, oh, somebody, calls you a name. The chance is you could die. Somebody
Yeah.
could decide to gay bash you or trans bash you and basically be like, I don't like you, so I'm going to attack you. And that's not a risk that I want to take ever. Sure,
Yeah.
it's a risk of just being alive. And, I'm sure your coworker had the greatest of intentions,
Yeah.
but you really have to weigh the options and weigh the space that you're into. So I love to
Exactly.
look like this, have a 24-inch bust down, like just like live the
Yeah.
entire fantasy. But sometimes I have to decide, when is it do I want to keep my safety net of being cis passing versus, having that affirming feeling. Which one is more important at the moment for me?
Yeah. And I think that even looking at being black, like, Daquan, I want to ask you, like, how does race play into how you interact with like non-black, non-binary individuals?
Child, it's a whole, I think race and gender and sexuality create this interesting intersection because, going to a predominantly white institution that did have queer spaces and people who identified as non-binary, there still felt a disconnect, even if
Yeah.
we both identified the same way in terms of our gender. There was still something about my experience that just was not getting reflected by you. And it sometimes just created uh, this distance, this kind of disparity where I didn't feel like I could fully be myself because my experience was not understood. And I think that even going back to the last question, there is this privilege in being a white non binary person and wearing
Yeah.
certain things versus being a black non binary person and wearing certain things. Um, because a lot of times in a lot of these white spaces, it's accepted a little bit more. And
Yeah.
if you're in a predominantly black space, we know how, there is homophobia and transphobia in the community, in the black community, just like every community, by the way. But there's
Exactly.
also the undertones of like the black church being at the center of the black community and all of these other things, and the way that the patriarchy and white supremacy forces or pushes down black people to the point of being homophobic and transphobic, that
Yeah.
creates an entirely different environment. So I the white NYC non-binary experience is different from the black NYC non-binary experience, and even my experience is different from a lot of other black people. So it's
Yeah.
one of these things where if I can have my experience as a black non-binary person be so different from other black non-binary persons, even if we're in the same area, imagine how different it would be for a white non-binary person who lives in like this upper class white neighborhood and all of this other stuff.
Yeah. I think, you know, white non-binary people still have more privilege than black and POC non-binary people. I've had to limit my interactions with certain non-binary white people because just like cis white people, their whiteness clouds their judgment of the world around them. And what I mean by that is, for me, and like Daquan said too, there are certain people who I don't have the non binary conversation with because one, I don't see them on a regular basis. And two, it's not worth the emotional labor to have to go through the whole coming out routine again. Some white non-binary individuals don't understand the intersection of my identity as a Black person. For example, I had a situation where a non-binary individual um, outed themselves and me as a non-binary person to a Black coworker. And as a white person, their race protected them from that Black coworker's disrespect or intrusive questioning in a more significant way than myself. You know, if they disrespect the white person, management is more likely to take action than if they disrespected me, which made me an easier target. Now, this is not to say that white non-binary people are, exempt from prejudice or hate because of their identity. It is simply saying that their race has nothing to do with the level of prejudice they experience because of it. And as a Black person, my race contributes heavily to the amount of prejudice I receive among other Black people in ways that white non-binary people just won't understand. In that same situation as well, recently, even that same white non-binary person, we were at a work assembly, and one of the speakers who just came there just for the day had addressed me as sir when they raised my hand to speak. And I didn't think nothing of it because, again, bitch, I'm not going to see you ever again. I don't really have the fucking time to go through this whole thing. We're just going to be here for another 2 hours. But that white non-binary person took it upon themselves to go talk to that speaker during our lunch break and tell them my pronouns. And so during my lunch break, I had this person come up to me and say, "Oh, I'm so sorry I disrespected you. I just didn't mean to the whole thing." And I was caught off guard because I was like, "Girl, the fuck? I didn't even tell you this shit." And so I had to let that non-binary person know, like, "Hey, that is not your place. For one, you don't get to decide who I come out to. And two, you could have put my life at risk because I don't know who this woman is and I don't know who she knows. And I'm Black and you're white. So there is a difference there in how this person will react to me versus how they'll react to you." And the problem is not enough white people in the LGBTQIA plus community want to acknowledge the privilege that their whiteness affords them. And that's why we keep running into problems like this. But Daquon, I want to pass it back to you. What do you think?
I completely agree. Like, we have to realize that there is privilege with whiteness, period.
Yes.
Regardless of how many other intersection identities you have, there is privilege with whiteness. And I think that, like you said, a lot of white LGBTQ plus people use being queer as a way to absolve them from their whiteness. And that's
Mm-hmm.
not something you can do. And it also creates an even larger disparity from white queer people versus Black queer people because they think that they can absolve their race using their sexuality or gender. But
Mm-hmm.
we know that we can't. It's
Exactly.
all interacting and happening at the same time,
Mm-hmm.
intersectionality. So that creates an even higher level of disparity because I see a white non-binary person just like acting like they're just non-binary. They're not white, they're non-binary. And it's like, no, you that's not how things work. So it's one of these things where, like you said, you have certain risk as a Black non-binary person, especially a Black non-binary person who uses she her pronouns,
Yeah.
that your coworker will never be able to understand. So
Yeah.
it you just have to be able to recognize and acknowledge that your identity is different from others, and you can't use your experience as a white non-binary person to think about every single other experience to be the exact same. And like you said, this is why we're having constant discourse on top of discourse, and there's some new social media argument popping up every couple months, weeks, days, even
Yeah.
because of this difference.
Yeah. And I wanted to say, like, Daquon, what are some of the new struggles, that being Black and non-binary have produced in your life?
Who, girl? I think that one of the new struggles is just like contemplating how I was raised or how I was socialized in this world as a Black man.
Yeah.
Because even though I identify as non binary, that socialization doesn't necessarily leave me. For
Yeah.
example, I think one of the biggest things is a lot of times Black men are seen as being aggressive,
Yeah.
thugs,
Yeah.
gangsters, like, and you have a certain way that you have to handle certain situations so you don't get seen as that, or you have certain ways that you have to deal with the police, etc.,
Yeah.
etc. Just because I'm non-binary doesn't mean like, oh well, like, I'm not a Black man, I'm non-binary, like those things don't apply to me, because I still get perceived in that way, and I was still socialized in that way. So
Yeah.
even if I wasn't getting perceived in that way, my thought process still works like that. It doesn't automatically just turn off because I started to identify as non-binary. So I think that's one of the biggest ways that your socialization still impacts you. And even I've seen a lot of discourse online about how people, even though they're non-binary, still identify as a Black woman because there are
Yeah.
certain ways that they have been socialized and certain experiences and parts of their identity that still align with being a Black woman even though they are non-binary.
Yeah, I think that even when I was discussing during this work assembly, we had a sociology person come in talking about creating community and creating all this stuff. And they were like, if you see a kid that's not supposed to be where they at, tell them where they are. And the first thing I came up to her after the fact was like, there was this video that was circulating around the internet a long while back. And it was kind of started this discourse where, like, I think it was Blackish, where there was a white little girl in the elevator crying, and the main character Blackish, one of the the guy, I don't know what his name is, but he like backed away from the fucking elevator and let it close and left her crying. And everybody was like, why did you leave her crying? Why did you let X, Y, and Z? And he was like, because of the implication. Because as a Black man, if I walked in there to try to console her, all people see is a Black aggressive man and a white crying little girl. And so there's all these preconceived ideas of what could have transpired to why this little girl is crying. And so when I was talking to the sociology person, I was like, as a Black person, I identify, regardless of my identity, people perceive me as a Black man. So like, how do I, try to create this community, and how do I try to do this when there's all these preconceived notions? She was like, bitch, I don't know. And that shit, this doctorate degree level, like, she was like, I mean, if she better said it very professionally, she was like, I don't have any, I don't know what to tell you. But basically, she was like, bitch, I don't fucking know. I don't know what the fuck you do.
Sucks for
And
you.
it sucks for you, is what she said. But like, it was frustrating to me because, like I said, like, it really is like that. One of the main struggles, I've run into is this whole idea that me simply existing is somehow contributing to this supposed emasculation of the Black man theory that many people in the Black community believe is a thing. And it's really fucking irritating because the whole theory has roots in slavery, homophobia, and transphobia. But we've already broken that down before on the show, on the episode titled The Emasculation of the Black Man Myth. So go on and check that out if you want a more thorough breakdown of our thoughts. But the point is, my existence as a non-binary person who enjoys wearing and doing things that society considers to be solely for cis women is seen as an attack against the Black community. I mean, many trans people as well as Black gay men can attest to this as well. The Black community as a whole doesn't rally for me, but vehemently against me. And in the Black community, many of the ways that we connect with each other through churches, barbershops, and beauty shops, in those spaces, people like me have been shunned once we were discovered as LGBTQIA, ridiculed, brutalized, and even killed by homophobic Black men in the community specifically. Um, I don't. I don't have the same freedom to connect to those in my community in the same way as a straight Black man or a straight Black woman can. And don't even get me started on dating as a Black non-binary person. I mean, it was already fucking difficult enough being Black in the community, of the gay community, with, you know, being seen as undesirable by other Black men who exclusively date white men, being fetishized by white men but never desired romantically by them, and being on the bottom of the gay dating pool for every other race. I mean, the amount of people that are interested in gay Black men romantically already feels like a very shallow pond rather than a pool. Add being non binary to the mix, and that cuts that pond down to a small stream.
If
But
that,
Daquan, have
a
you run into those
puddle.
kind of issues?
Man, that pond is more like a puddle.
It
Like,
is.
but I completely agree. It's something that's so bizarre to think about, because it's like you should understand how it is to feel marginalized, and therefore you shouldn't further marginalize people. But we know that's not the case. And like you
Yeah.
said, dating is its own completely different thing, because even as somebody, like, it would be one thing if I just identified as non-binary, because
Yeah.
then it's like, okay, you're like diet man, you're like
No. Oh my God.
man light.
Stop. Stop.
But also as somebody who, identifies as non-binary and have pictures of me in full makeup, that also creates another level to it of
Yeah.
being even more visibly queer, that people are just like, if it was just the non-binary thing, I could get with it, but the whole makeup thing and all of that, nah, it's not with me. And it's like, girl, come on, like, get over it.
Get
I'm
over it.
through.